Okay, let's unpack this. We have been handed a stack of sources for a deep dive that presents a fascinating, almost aggressive economic argument. We're looking at specific quantitative data points concerning the first year of a political administration, specifically leading up to, well, the close of 2025. And the sources are not shy. They claim the outcome of this period was an unquestionable success. Our mission today is to unpack these bold, detailed claims covering everything from budget cuts to global growth rates and understand the evidence presented that supposedly contradicted the widespread, often dire predictions of economic disaster.
And for you, the learner, this is an exceptional case study in economic narrative control. We aren't just summarizing a year's performance, we are examining a thesis statement. The sources argue, with remarkable specificity, that supply-side policies delivered positive, verifiable results exactly where their ideological opponents, what the source calls the social democrat consensus, predicted absolute failure. This is really about comparing theoretical models against claimed empirical outcomes in real time.
And the tone of the material is critical to understanding it. It's a tone of um, vindication. It's a direct challenge to the financial and political establishment, using highly specific hard data points as ammunition. They are attempting to shatter a prevailing narrative.
Exactly. And that sheer confidence, backed by metrics across fiscal responsibility, monetary stability, and employment quality, is what dictates the structure of our analysis. When you are confronted with such absolute claims of success, you have to immediately isolate the key metrics, the change in the deficit, the stability of bond yields, the genuine inflation rate, and maybe most importantly, the type of jobs being created. These documents direct us straight to those numbers, arguing that the market delivered a verdict in favor of fiscal conservatism.
So let's frame this battle. This dive starts with a premise that the stakes were impossibly high. We need to establish the narrative hook, the huge, almost existential gap between the catastrophic economic collapse that was widely feared in late 2024 and early 2025 and the reality that allegedly manifested by December 31st, 2025.
Right. It's all about that contrast.
We have to begin with the dire forecasts, because the source material makes a point of dwelling on the extremity of what they term the consensus predictions. We're talking about claims that went far beyond mere economic slowdown. These were claims of systemic, guaranteed collapse.
And the document suggests this hyperbole served a specific political purpose. The idea was to maximize public fear and opposition to the incoming administration's stated policies, namely tax cuts, massive deregulation, and trade policy adjustments. The more extreme the prediction, the greater the pressure on the new policies.
Okay, so let's list the four most striking predictions the source claims were widely circulated. First, the most straightforward. The widely circulated prediction that the U.S. economy would enter a deep and painful recession in 2025, a complete economic contraction within the first year.
And the underlying reasoning for that prediction was critical. Opponents argued that the incoming administration's focus on tariffs and renegotiating trade agreements would immediately disrupt these highly optimized global supply chains. The economic logic was that these disruptions would act as a massive tax on businesses and consumers, dramatically increasing input costs, choking off business investment, and, well, inevitably plunging the country into a severe downturn. The source is very clear that this was the foundational fear.
The second was the inflation fear. And this wasn't just about prices creeping up a little bit. The prediction was for an acceleration of the inflationary cycle, expected to hit severe, elevated levels, with specific estimates often mentioning 6%, 7%, or even higher than the peaks we saw back in 2021. The source explicitly links this high inflation fear directly to the new commercial policy changes.
Right, and this is a crucial area of tension. If you simultaneously implement large tax cuts, which could increase demand, and impose significant trade barriers, which could restrict supply and increase import costs, while traditional economic models suggest that you have a recipe for severe inflationary pressure that the Federal Reserve would be powerless to stop. The consensus argued that the administration was effectively guaranteeing a dramatic spike in the cost of living.
Third, and this kind of compounds the first two, was the specter of stagflation and complete economic collapse. And for the learner, stagflation is that profoundly destructive economic paradox. High inflation coupled with stagnant or contracting economic growth is truly a policy nightmare.
It is. Because traditional solutions to inflation, like tightening monetary policy, just worsen the stagnation. And the traditional solutions to stagnation, like fiscal stimulus, just make the inflation worse. The source material, drawing on the most pessimistic media coverage of late 2024, describes this as the predicted complete sinking of the economy due to the expected trade wars and fiscal policies. The narrative was that the U.S. would become a high-cost, low-growth economy simultaneously, a total disaster.
And the fourth fear, the one that touched the heart of global finance, the bond market collapse. The consensus allegedly believed that the policies would be viewed internationally as fiscally reckless, destabilizing global finance, and destroying faith in U.S. debt. They predicted a massive sell-off, forcing the yield required on the benchmark 10-year U.S. bonds to skyrocket, with figures often cited reaching 6, 7, or even 7.5%.
And that's not just a technical number. The 10-year yield is the global reference point for interest rates, for mortgages, for business lending. A spike to 7% would have meant a severe financial crisis, making borrowing prohibitively expensive for everyone. The prediction was essentially that the market would deliver a vote of no confidence in the administration's financial stability.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the sources we are analyzing assert that the reality by the time the calendar turned to 2026 was the precise opposite of these four catastrophic predictions. The source's summary of 2025 centers entirely on strong economic growth, inflation that was contained, robust private employment, and a demonstrable, measurable return to fiscal responsibility.
This is where the ideological battle becomes data-driven. The source explicitly argues that those who champion policies of economic logic, meaning deep tax cuts, aggressive deregulation, and fiscal restraint, were absolutely validated. They argue that the predicted failure was merely the desperate, politically motivated projection of a consensus that opposed change. The document claims that those voices who predicted failure attempted to cancel or veto any dissenting economists or analysts who supported the incoming administration's economic platform.
It sets up the narrative perfectly. A decisive battle of economic philosophies, where the quantitative data, the raw numbers we are about to explore, is presented as the impartial judge, delivering a resounding verdict in favor of the supply-side approach. Now we transition to the specific mechanisms of this alleged victory, starting with the immediate surgical cuts made to government operations and finances.
Right. How did they claim to pull it off?
So what does this all mean for the machinery of government? According to our sources, the first year was defined by an aggressive, systematic overhaul of the federal government structure and a radical reduction in its spending habits. And the administration faced a severely constrained fiscal environment from day one.
That constraint is the essential context needed to appreciate the claims of success. The source highlights that the administration inherited a budget already consumed practically in its entirety to the tune of 97% by the previous administration's continuation bills. For the listener, this means the new team was legally obligated to fund the massive spending priorities and debt commitments of their predecessors. They had virtually zero flexible funding to start new programs or, crucially, to softly phase in cuts. Any measurable change had to be aggressive and immediate.
And the claims of aggression are striking. Let's look at Claim 2.1, deficit reduction. The source claims that despite the inherited constraints, the federal deficit was reduced by a significant 22% in the first year.
22%. A 22% reduction in the federal deficit in a single year is a major fiscal feat, especially without a booming, self-sustaining economy to drive revenue or a mandate to raise taxes. The sources are careful to explain that this was achieved through a dual approach, both increased revenues and significantly reduced expenditures. We need to break down how that balance was claimed.
Well, the argument is that the increased revenues were not driven by higher taxes, but by the strong economic growth we'll discuss later, which expanded the tax base. Meanwhile, the aggressive expenditure cuts were the administration's direct action to control the spending side.
So the source posits that this balanced growth-driven revenue coupled with serious spending control is vital. If the deficit reduction had been achieved solely through crippling taxation, the source argues, it would have choked off the incipient growth. Instead, they claim the growth fueled the revenue, while surgical cuts controlled the spending. It speaks directly to their philosophy of fiscal responsibility enabling, not inhibiting, growth.
Right. And moving on to Claim 2.2, cutting the political footprint. This is where the philosophy of less government, better growth really manifests. The source details the elimination of a staggering 217,000 political federal jobs they immediately label as having been inflated and unnecessary under the prior administration.
217,000 is an immense number. And the source is very precise about the nature of these cuts, right? They're talking exclusively about political federal employment, which is explicitly defined as jobs not related to essential frontline services like mail delivery, veterans health care, necessary military functions, or air traffic control.
Exactly. The claim is that this strategic reduction in non-essential, often politically aligned bureaucratic employment brought the total number of federal employees in this category down to levels not seen in 11 years. This is the core of their narrative,
Hmm.
dismantling what the source calls a system of disguised employment paid for by borrowing and inflation and reallocating that human capital back into the productive, tax-paying private sector.
And the spending cuts were systematic. Federal spending overall was allegedly reduced by 10% over the first 2 quarters of the administration. And showing commitment to the long game, an additional aggressive 8% reduction in political spending was already ordered and budgeted for the following year, 2026. This isn't just a one-off effort. The source presents it as a systemic, permanent downsizing of the governmental apparatus.
This systemic shift is central. The administration, as presented in these documents, aimed to prove that significant government size reduction could be achieved without triggering the recession that opponents predicted. They argue that this move freed up substantial resources, financial capital from reduced payroll and human capital from the laid-off workers, to be reinvested and reemployed in the private sector, directly feeding the higher quality GDP growth we will examine shortly.
Okay, so Claim 2.3 brings us to the core supply-side mechanism, regulatory and tax overhaul. The source confirms the implementation of the largest tax cuts in decades. This is the classic accelerant for the supply-side platform.
Tax cuts are designed to directly increase the incentive to invest, hire, and produce goods and services. By allowing businesses and individuals to retain more capital, the theoretical result is an immediate boost in productive capacity and long-term investment. When you combine this massive influx of capital into the private sector with the simultaneous reduction in bureaucratic overhead and regulatory drag, the source argues, you create a powerful economic engine.
And the regulatory element is brutally aggressive. The source highlights the policy of eliminating 10 regulations for every new norm approved. This 10-for-1 rule is a symbolic and high-impact measure designed to immediately signal complete reversal of the bureaucratic impulse. The source emphasizes that this was a primary driver of private sector relief and efficiency gains, cutting down on administrative and compliance costs that often stifle small and medium-sized businesses.
The 10-for-1 rule works by forcing every agency to continuously audit its existing regulations for relevance and necessity. It essentially treats regulations as a depletable resource that must be traded against. This demonstrates an overwhelming administrative priority, reducing the cost and complexity of interacting with the government, thereby promoting the source's goal of giving the economy back to the citizens.
Finally, Claim 2.4 details 2 non-fiscal policy shifts with profound implications for the structure of finance and public discourse. First, the prohibition of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
This CBDC prohibition is highly significant and deserves a closer look. While many developed nations are exploring or implementing digital versions of their national currency, the source presents this prohibition as a fundamental defense of financial privacy and decentralized control. The argument is that a government-controlled digital currency would allow unprecedented surveillance and control over individual financial transactions, potentially compromising the economic freedom the administration claims to champion. This move directly signals a preference for traditional, decentralized financial infrastructure.
Second, the source meets the claimed recovery of freedom of expression, though the documents themselves remain vague on the precise mechanisms used to achieve this goal, focusing instead on the impact on public discourse.
If we connect all these fiscal and regulatory actions to the bigger picture, the source argues that this combination of aggressive deficit cutting, massive deregulation, and a significant reduction in the public payroll fundamentally changed the quality of economic growth. The philosophical question raised is, what are the long-term implications of shifting reliance so heavily from debt-fueled public spending to purely private sector investment and growth?
The implication, as framed by the source, is a philosophical repudiation of Keynesian spending models. They claim that reducing government size and spending did not cause the predicted recession. Instead, it liberated resources, fostering a cleaner, more sustainable form of growth derived from actual, measurable productivity and private investment, rather than growth artificially inflated by public debt and bureaucratic payrolls, which means the macro numbers must now be scrutinized.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is the emphasis on the quality of growth. The source isn't satisfied merely hitting a high GDP number. They are actively arguing that they changed the composition of the growth to make it more robust and sustainable.
Let's look at Claim 3.1, economic growth. The source boasts that the economy is growing robustly, citing a Q3 growth rate of 3.8%. Furthermore, The highly respected Atlanta Federal Reserve allegedly estimated an annualized growth of 3.5%. This places the U.S. firmly in expansion territory, providing the first major contradiction of the recession forecast from Section 1.
And the qualitative distinction they draw is essential. They explicitly frame this as growth of higher quality because the contribution of public spending to the GDP calculation was intentionally reduced, a direct consequence of the budget cuts we just discussed. A greater proportion of the 3.5% growth rate is attributed, therefore, to private investment, business expansion, and genuine consumer activity rather than governmental stimulus. This is the ultimate justification for the success of supply-side policies in their view, proving you can shrink the government contribution while increasing the total economic pie.
But let's pause and introduce a critical lens, which is lacking in the original source material. While 3.5% growth is excellent, how much of this momentum could be attributed to underlying economic cycles that predate the new policies? Isn't it common for a new administration to benefit from policies, or at least the momentum already in the pipeline from the previous year?
That's a crucial question. The source preemptively addresses this challenge by pointing to the acceleration in Q3, that 3.8% figure, and the sustained Atlanta Fed forecast. They argue that while momentum existed, the sharp policy reversal, specifically the regulatory relief and tax cuts, provided the necessary catalyst to break through what was perceived as a previous ceiling on growth. They claim the U.S. is the fastest-growing developed economy, explicitly stating it is surpassing major peers like Canada, the UK, Japan, France, Germany, and Italy.
If the U.S. is indeed dramatically outgrowing all these major developed nations, while simultaneously reducing its fiscal deficit and the overall size of its government footprint, it suggests, as the source argues, a profound validation that the domestic supply-side policies are working in isolation from global trends.
Right. And moving to claim 3.2, employment quality. This section directly addresses the elephant in the room, the 217,000 political job cuts. The source argues that the economy compensated fully and rapidly. They boast of achieving the best November for private domestic employment, both when seasonally adjusted and in nominal terms.
This is the crux of the employment battle. The source's narrative promotes a powerful contrast. The intentional targeted reduction of non-essential public sector employment was not a drag on the overall labor market. Instead, it was more than replaced by higher quality, wealth-generating, market-driven employment in the private sector.
And the source hammers home the concept of disguised employment. This is their term for public sector jobs that, in their view, were paid for using inflationary debt, adding no genuine productive capacity to the economy. The claim is that these debt-funded positions were successfully replaced by higher quality employment in the productive sectors, which they argue is inherently more sustainable and indicative of true economic health. It represents a philosophical shift from government as employer to government as facilitator.
And that leads perfectly into the metric that truly matters to the average citizen. Claim 3.3, real wages and purchasing power. The source claims that real wages, so real income, are rising. This is presented as the ultimate success, directly contrasting with the previous years where, as the source alleges, high inflation systematically destroyed American purchasing power.
The movement in real wages is arguably the most sensitive indicator of economic health for the listener. Real wage growth means that the increase in a person's paycheck is finally outpacing the growth in the cost of living. By claiming real wages are rising, the source claims they have met the difficult dual policy goal, controlling the inflationary pressure previously generated by government debt and boosting private sector productivity to support nominal wage growth.
They offer a very specific target benchmark. Americans' purchasing power is claimed to be superior to 2019 levels and improving for the first time in several years. What does achieving superior purchasing power to 2019 actually translate to in tangible terms for the listener?
It means that, for the first time since the inflationary peaks, the average worker's paycheck buys more than it did before the pandemic and subsequent inflation took hold. Think about groceries, fuel, and discretionary spending. If their claim holds true, the policies delivered a genuine, measurable increase in leverage against daily living costs. This suggests that the tax cuts, coupled with deregulation, successfully expanded supply and capacity enough to meet demand without spiking prices further.
This is the core supply-side argument in action. Cutting the cost of production, via deregulation and taxes, and reducing the cost of government via cuts and deficit reduction, stabilized prices. And that allowed nominal wage growth to finally translate into meaningful real-world gains for households.
It's a powerful claim.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we return to the high-stakes predictions about financial collapse, the guaranteed bond market crash, and the runaway inflation tied to trade policy. The sources directly confront these fears using late 2025 data.
The conventional wisdom, the consensus the source is challenging, was that the administration's trade actions would be inflationary, causing major supply shocks that the central bank could not contain, thereby forcing continuous interest rate hikes. The source claims the opposite occurred.
That brings us to Claim 4.1, Inflation Control and the Fed. Contrary to the frightening predictions of 6 or 7% inflation, the source asserts that inflation is decisively controlled, specifically claiming it is running at or below the levels seen in September or October of the previous year. This suggests that the inflationary momentum had not only been stopped, but had significantly decelerated.
And this is presented as a fundamental disproving of the trade shock narrative. If inflation is contained, it means the alleged supply disruption caused by the new trade policies was either negligible or successfully mitigated by the massive supply-side stimulus from deregulation and tax cuts. The crucial consequence highlighted is that the Federal Reserve was allegedly forced into what the source terms a capitulation to lower interest rates.
Explain that term, capitulation. Why use such a strong word?
Well, the source uses capitulation because the Fed had, for months, maintained a hawkish stance, expecting the administration's policies to generate high inflation and requiring high rates to counter it. If the Fed is now lowering rates, it signals that the underlying data, the inflation indicators, and the overall economic health disproved the central bank's initial fears. The source presents this as the independent market data validating the administration's fiscal and supply policies, forcing the central bank to adjust its monetary policy accordingly. It's presented as the triumph of empirical reality over institutional pessimism.
Now for Claim 4.2. The bond market surprise. This was the most dramatic prediction of all, that the 10-year Treasury yield would skyrocket to 7% due to fiscal irresponsibility and risk.
That catastrophic prediction was built on the premise that the tax cuts would not be offset by spending reductions, leading to ballooning debt, political instability, and a dramatic loss of investor confidence. Lenders would demand a 7% return to absorb that risk.
Instead, according to the sources, the yield did the exact opposite of skyrocket. The yield allegedly declined and remained firmly below the 4.16% mark. That number, 4.16%, is critical. It implies a stability that was entirely unexpected.
The behavior of the bond market is a direct measure of perceived risk. A declining or stable yield below 4.16% implies dramatically less perceived fiscal risk and significantly reduced inflation fear in the medium and long term. If investors truly believed the U.S. economy was spiraling toward recession and massive uncontrolled debt, the yield would have spiked, just as predicted. The fact that the source claims it declined is presented as a total contradiction of the social democrat consensus, suggesting that market trust in the U.S. government's ability to manage its finances was restored, not destroyed, by the deficit reduction efforts.
It essentially means the global financial community believed the administration's promises of fiscal discipline over the political punditry predicting collapse.
And finally, Claim 4.3 addresses the commercial balance, the trade deficit. The source claims that the commercial deficit, which allegedly increased constantly under the previous administration, has been reduced spectacularly and very, very significantly.
This links the contentious trade policy back to a clear macro outcome. Critics feared that tariffs and new trade barriers would lead to an exodus of exports and crippling costs. The source's counterclaim is that the combination of strong domestic growth, which reduced reliance on foreign goods, and successful renegotiations led to a massive reduction in the trade imbalance.
This is a powerful summation. A reduced commercial deficit means fewer dollars are leaving the country relative to those coming in, which strengthens the dollar and provides greater national economic stability. The overall conclusion presented by the sources is that the supply-side policies simultaneously delivered a spectacular reduction in the fiscal deficit and a very significant reduction in the commercial deficit. This addresses the core concerns about both internal government overspending and external trade imbalances.
It really ties everything together into a single narrative.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this entire comprehensive narrative, supported by these data points, is built around one single overarching conclusion: the verifiable success of what they term supply-side policies. The source uses the breadth of these results, from employment quality to bond stability to deficit cuts, as proof that their ideology is economically superior.
And they credit the policies specifically and systematically. The source attributes the claim's success, the 22% deficit reduction, the robust 3.5% growth rate, the genuine real wage improvement, and the reduced commercial imbalances, not to luck or prior momentum, but directly to the core tenets. Massive tax cuts, aggressive deregulation via the 10-for-1 rule, the reduced administrative burden, and quoting the source, giving the economy back to the citizens.
The philosophical argument being reinforced here is that government intervention, excessive spending, and regulation are not stabilizing forces, but rather expensive drags on productivity. By contrast, tax cuts and deregulation are claimed to unlock the inherent massive productive potential of the private sector. The sources present the 2025 results as empirical evidence that this model works, even when confronted with what they repeatedly describe as an inherited economic disaster.
They're very clear about the direction of travel. The source acknowledges that much more work needs to be done to fully clean up the inherited disaster from the previous administration, particularly regarding long-term national debt. But they confirm that the path is the correct one because the ideas work.
And critically, they look ahead using external validation. They cite the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, specifically estimating U.S. growth of at least 2.3% for the following year, 2026. Citing a highly cautious international body like the IMF, which is not politically aligned with the administration, lends significant weight to the claim that this economic trajectory is sustainable and recognized globally. This helps neutralize any immediate claims that the 2025 results were merely a short-term, unsustainable bounce.
So let's synthesize these sweeping claims. The dive concludes, according to these sources, that by the end of 2025, the U.S. economy is claimed to be growing faster than all its developed peers, simultaneously creating a higher quality of employment by shifting jobs from the public payroll to the private sector, and improving the overall quality of GDP growth by reducing the government's debt-fueled spending contribution. All of this, the sources assert, was achieved while stabilizing both the fiscal and commercial deficits and increasing real wages and purchasing power above 2019 levels.
It is a comprehensive, multifaceted argument designed to provide quantitative evidence that one specific economic ideology not only avoided catastrophe, but delivered widespread prosperity, thoroughly rejecting every major prediction made by its opposition.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? We've conducted a deep dive into a powerful counter-narrative to prevailing economic pessimism, detailing impressive figures across fiscal health, employment quality, and inflation control for the period ending late 2025. This entire exploration was less about the policy's political roots and more about the alleged results used to justify that policy.
The biggest takeaway for you is the absolute necessity of rigorous analysis versus ideological prediction. When you analyze policy success or failure, it is vital to track granular hard data points like the 22% deficit cut, the specific number of political jobs eliminated, or the surprisingly low behavior of the 10-year bond yield remaining below 4.16%, and compare those against broad, catastrophic predictions. The source's effectiveness lies in tying every claim of success to a measurable number that allegedly defied conventional wisdom.
This brings us to our final provocative thought for the road, one that builds on these claimed results. If aggressive deregulation, major tax cuts, and significant systemic reductions in non-essential public jobs are indeed the verifiable engines behind robust, non-inflationary growth, reduced deficits, and rising real wages, as these comprehensive sources claim, then we must ask,
Does that evidence fundamentally challenge established assumptions about the necessity of expansionary, debt-fueled government spending during periods where inflation risks are high and fiscal responsibility is supposedly paramount?
it gives us plenty to consider for our next deep dive. Thanks for learning with us.